All I wanted on Father's Day was to spend dinner beside my 10-year-old grandson. Instead, my daughter's father-in-law mocked my old clothes, backhanded me across the face, and sneered, "A man like you should know his place." My own wife looked me in the eye and said, "Just apologize and stop embarrassing us." The entire table fell silent. Everyone looked away, until my 10-year-old grandson suddenly stood up and did something that made the entire room turn pale. Before this story starts, tell me where you're from. Country, city, wherever you are. The Dad Family Revenge community spans more places than I can count, and tonight I want to hear from you. A note: this story includes fictional elements woven in for depth and impact. No real names or locations are referenced, but the message at the heart of it, that one belongs to everyone. The mirror in my bathroom doesn't lie. That's always been its problem. I stood there on the morning of Father's Day, staring at a man in a faded blue shirt, the kind that had been washed so many times the color had given up fighting. My hands, thick, scarred, the knuckles permanently stained from 40 years of concrete and steel, gripped the edge of the sink like I was trying to hold myself steady against a current only I could feel. I thought about changing, putting on something newer, something that wouldn't give Richard Coleman another reason to smile that smile of his, the one that never reached his eyes, the one that said, "I see exactly what you are, and it is not much." Then I thought about Margaret, my first wife, the woman who used to press her palm flat against my chest on Sunday mornings and say, "Harold, you are more than what you wear. You are more than what you own. Don't ever let anyone make you forget that." She had been gone 11 years, and I still heard her voice clearer than anything else in this house. I let go of the sink, straightened my collar, left the shirt exactly as it was. I had built Northbridge Capital Trust over 22 years, quietly, carefully, the way I had built everything in my life. Not with flash, not with press releases, but with patience and with work. Most people who met me saw a retired construction foreman living on a CalPERS pension in a small house in San Gabriel Valley. They saw the old pickup truck in the driveway, the reading glasses on the kitchen table, the slightly worn shoes by the door. They did not see the Delaware-registered trust that held assets most people couldn't calculate without a spreadsheet. They did not see the Century City office where David Carter managed the details I preferred not to touch directly. And they certainly did not see the $22 million that 6 months ago had quietly flowed into Coleman Construction LLC, the company belonging to my daughter's father-in-law, and pulled it back from the edge of bankruptcy like a man grabbing a drowning stranger by the collar. Linda, my wife of 7 years, had never known. She knew I was comfortable. She knew the pension covered the bills with room to breathe. But she did not know about the trust, because I had structured it before we met, and because, if I was being honest with myself, I had never been entirely sure she needed to. That thought made my chest ache in a way I didn't want to examine too closely on a Sunday morning. I poured my coffee, walked to the back door, and looked out at the small square of yard where Ethan and I had spent last Thanksgiving pretending to fish in a blue plastic storage bin. He had been absolutely convinced we were going to catch something. He had waited 45 minutes with a stick and a piece of string, completely serious, completely certain, the way only a 10-year-old can be certain of something that makes no sense at all. That was the thing about Ethan Coleman. He made the world feel like it still had room for good things. My phone buzzed on the counter. I already knew who it was before I picked it up. Grandpa. His voice was slightly breathless, like he'd been running. "Are you coming tonight? Because I made your card already, and I put it in my desk drawer, and Dad said I couldn't give it to you until dinner. But I've been waiting since Thursday, and that is a very long time." My throat tightened so fast it surprised me. I pressed my hand flat against my sternum the way Margaret used to do, trying to hold something in. "I'm coming, buddy," I said. "Wouldn't miss it." "Okay." A pause. Then quieter. Grandpa. It might be kind of weird tonight. Dad said to tell you that Grandpa Richard is going to be there and that you should he said to just be calm. But I don't know why he said that because you're always calm. The coffee in my mug had gone still. Outside, the morning light was turning gold over the yard. Your dad's right, I told him. I'll be calm. I promise. After we hung up, I stood in the kitchen for a long moment, the mug warm in both hands. I had known this evening was coming for weeks. I had known what Richard Coleman was, what he had done with the money, what he was planning, what he thought of me. I had known all of it, and I had chosen to wait. Not out of weakness. Not because I was afraid, because there is a difference between a man who acts when he is angry and a man who acts when he is ready. And I had spent 66 years learning which one I wanted to be. I set the mug in the sink, picked up my keys, and walked out the door. I didn't drive straight to Bel Air. I told myself it was because I had time, that I was in no rush, that a man of 66 has earned the right to take the long way around. But the truth, I admitted to myself somewhere on the 210 freeway, watching the San Gabriel Mountains go pale gold in the morning light, was that I needed to see Glenn before I walked into that house. Pastor Glenn Morris had known me for 40 years. He had presided over Margaret's funeral. He had sat with me in this very church 3 weeks after she passed, when I couldn't sleep and had nowhere else to go at 2 a.m. And he had not said a single word for the first hour. He had just made coffee, set a mug in front of me, and waited. That was Glenn. He never pushed. He just made space. The church in Pasadena was small and white, and looked like it had been there since before the freeway existed. I pulled my truck into the empty lot and sat for a moment, hands still on the wheel engine ticking as it cooled. Inside, Glenn was arranging hymnals in the back pew. He looked up when he heard my boots on the floor and broke into the kind of smile that made the lines around his eyes go deep. "Harold Bennett," he said, setting the hymnals down. "You look like a man walking towards something he's not sure he wants to reach." "That obvious," I said. "Only to someone who's watched you walk for 40 years. He gestured to the front pew. "Sit down. I'll get the coffee." The coffee was terrible as it always was. Glenn had been making bad church coffee since 1987 and showed no signs of improvement. I wrapped both hands around the mug and felt something in my shoulders begin to loosen. "Richard Coleman's hosting a Father's Day dinner tonight," I said. Glenn settled in the pew across from me, his big hands folded over his knees. "How many times has that man insulted you at a family gathering? Enough that I've stopped counting. And you're going anyway. Ethan called me this morning." My voice came out rougher than I intended. I cleared my throat. "That boy has been carrying that card in his desk drawer since Thursday, Glenn. He told me he's been waiting since Thursday. What am I supposed to do with that?" Glenn nodded slowly the way he did when he was turning something over in his mind. "You know," he said, "most men in your position would have put Richard Coleman in his place a long time ago. Most men in my position don't have a 10-year-old grandson who still thinks the world is basically good," I said. "I'm not willing to take that from him. Not yet." Glenn was quiet for a moment, studying his coffee mug. Then he looked up. "Harold, I've known you since you were a young man with concrete dust in your hair and more pride than sense. And I've watched you build things, buildings a company, a life with more patience than most people can imagine." He paused. "What are you going to do tonight if Richard crosses a line you can't come back from?" My jaw tightened. The morning light came through the narrow windows in long yellow bars, laying themselves across the floor between us. "I've been preparing for that possibility for 2 months," I said. "I have people in place, documents, Everything David needs to move the moment I make the call. Glenn's eyebrows rose slowly. You went in that deep. He stole from me, Glenn. The words came out flat and hard, the way a nail sounds going into wood. He took the money I gave him to save his company to protect my daughter's family, and he bought himself a $60,000 watch and a new kitchen for his Bel Air house. He forged my son-in-law's signature on documents that could have sent Daniel to prison. I stopped, breathed. I didn't go in deep. I went in exactly as deep as I needed to. Glenn set his mug down on the pew beside him. He reached over and gripped my forearm, the grip of an old man who has buried people and married people and held more hands in crisis than either of us could count. Then go, he said. Do what you need to do. Protect your daughter. Protect that boy. His grip tightened for just a moment. But Harold, before you walk through that door tonight, I need you to remember something. What's that? Remember who you are before any of this. His eyes held mine steady and clear. Not the trust, not the money, not the plan. You. The man Margaret loved. The man Ethan calls on a Sunday morning because he can't wait to give his grandfather a hand-drawn card. He let go of my arm. That man walks in there tonight, not the other one. Understood. My throat burned. I pressed my lips together hard and nodded once because speaking right then wasn't something I trusted myself to do cleanly. I finished the terrible coffee. Shook Glenn's hand at the door he held on an extra beat the way he had at Margaret's graveside, and walked back to my truck in the bright California morning. Bel Air was 40 minutes away. I had never felt the distance more. Linda was already in the passenger seat when I got home. She had dressed carefully, a cream blouse I had never seen before. Pearl earrings, her silver hair pinned back in a way that told me she had been sitting at the vanity mirror for at least 40 minutes. She held her purse in her lap with both hands the way she did when she was bracing for something she didn't want to say out loud. I climbed in, started the engine, and pulled out of the driveway without a word. We made it exactly 4 blocks before she began. Harold. Her voice had that particular tone, soft on the surface, firm underneath, like a throw pillow with a brick inside. I just want tonight to go smoothly. That's all I'm asking. I want that too, I said. Then can you please? She stopped, reorganized. Can you just not bring up the old jobs? The construction stories, Richard finds that kind of thing very, very what? She turned to look out the passenger window. You know what I mean. I kept my eyes on the road. The freeway opened up ahead of us, the afternoon sun laying itself flat and gold across 4 lanes of Sunday traffic. Linda, I have been to 4 family dinners at Richard Coleman's house. I have not once told a construction story that was not directly asked for. I know. She reached over and patted my hand on the gear shift, a quick, efficient pat, the kind that was more nervous habit than affection. I just think it would be easier if you let Richard steer the conversation. He likes to feel like the room is his, and if you just go along with that, then everyone has a nice evening. Something cool moved through my chest. Not anger. Not yet. Something quieter and more permanent than anger. You're asking me to make myself smaller, I said. So Richard Coleman feels bigger. Harold, that is not. Because that's what you're describing, Linda. I said it gently. I made sure I said it gently. You're describing a dinner where I sit in whatever chair he puts me in, eat whatever he decides I deserve, and smile while he asks me how my pension's holding up. And you're calling that a nice evening? Linda's hands tightened on her purse. Her jaw worked for a moment. He's Sarah's father-in-law. He's Ethan's grandfather on the other side. Like it or not, that man is part of this family, and making enemies of him helps nobody. I'm not making enemies of anyone, I said. I'm going to this dinner because my grandson has been carrying a Father's Day card in his desk drawer since Thursday. That is the only reason I'm in this truck right now. She exhaled sharply through her nose, a sound I had come to recognize as the conversational equivalent of a door slamming. I just don't want to be embarrassed, Harold. Is that so terrible to not want to spend the evening watching my husband get picked apart by Richard Coleman while he smiles and takes it? That stopped me, because underneath all of it, underneath the pearl earrings and the carefully chosen blouse and the brick inside the throw pillow, what I heard was something that sounded almost like fear. Not fear for me, fear of how it would look. Fear of what the room would think of the woman married to the man in the faded blue shirt. I let that sit in the cab of the truck for a long moment. Outside, the 110 South curved west toward the Santa Monica Mountains, and the houses got bigger, and the hedges got taller, and the spaces between gates and front doors got wider the way they always did as you moved from the valley toward Bel Air. Linda, I said finally. If something happens tonight, if Richard says something or does something, whose side are you going to be on? She blinked. Her fingers went very still on the purse clasp. That's a strange question. Is it? Nothing is going to happen, Harold. You're being dramatic. Humor me, I said. If something happens, whose side? She looked at me, and then she looked away, out at the widening streets and the tall hedges rolling past the window. Yours, she said. Obviously yours. She said it the way people say things they haven't actually decided yet. I nodded and kept driving. The gates of Bel Air appeared ahead, those old stone pillars standing at the entrance to a neighborhood built on the assumption that some people simply deserved more space than others. I slowed for the guard booth, gave the address, and was waved through. The truck felt very small on these streets. Harold? Linda's voice had gone softer, almost gentle. Just please, be calm tonight. I'm always calm, I said, and I meant it. I was calm the way a foundation is calm, not because nothing is pressing down on it, but because it was built to hold the weight. I turned onto the Coleman street and felt the evening begin. The Coleman estate sat behind a set of iron gates that opened with the slow, theatrical confidence of a man who had never once been told no. The driveway was pale stone, lined with olive trees trimmed into perfect spheres, and the house itself was the kind of white that required a full-time staff to maintain not a scuff, not a shadow, not a single blade of grass out of place. I parked my truck between a Mercedes and what I was fairly certain was a Porsche Cayenne, and for a brief moment I considered how the three vehicles looked side by side. Then I picked up the box of apple pie I had baked the night before and got out. Linda was already moving ahead of me, her heels clicking on the stone with quick, purposeful steps, putting distance between herself and the truck before anyone could associate the two. Richard Coleman met us at the top of the steps. He was wearing a navy blazer over a white linen shirt, open at the collar. A glass of champagne held loosely in one hand, the way men hold things they want you to notice. The Patek Philippe Nautilus on his left wrist caught the afternoon light and threw it back like a declaration. He was 64 years old and had spent every one of those years perfecting the art of making other people feel like guests in their own lives. The Herald. He said my name the way you say the name of a street you're not sure you're pronouncing correctly. His eyes moved from my face to my shirt, to my shoes, and back to my face in under 2 seconds. Glad you made it. Long drive from the valley. Not bad, I said. He had already turned to Linda, taking her hand, turning on the warmth like a faucet. Linda, you look wonderful. Come in, everyone's out back. I stepped forward and held out the pie box. Made it this morning. Apple brown sugar crust. Richard glanced at it the way you glance at something you've already decided not to want. He snapped 2 fingers at a young man in a white server's jacket standing just inside the door. Take that to the kitchen, he said, not looking at either of us. Staff entrance is around the side. The young man took the box from my hands without meeting my eyes. I watched him disappear around the corner of the house, carrying something I had spent an hour on the night before, and I breathed in through my nose and out through my mouth and reminded myself of what Glenn had said that morning. That man walks in there tonight. Not the other one. The backyard was expansive and golden in the late afternoon light, string lights not yet lit, long tables draped in white linen clusters of well-dressed people holding drinks and talking in the particular way of people who have never had to worry about whether the check will clear. I recognized a few faces from previous gatherings. Frank Delgado, Richard's longtime business partner, stood near the bar, in a charcoal suit, laughing at something I couldn't hear. Margaret Coleman, Richard's sister, was seated under a pergola, a glass of rosé in one hand, her eyes moving over the crowd like a lighthouse beam, cataloging and categorizing. When Margaret's gaze landed on me, it stayed for exactly 1 beat too long before sliding away. Sarah found me before I had taken 10 steps into the yard. She came quickly, her heels unsteady on the grass, and wrapped her arms around my neck with a tightness that told me everything about how she was feeling without her having to say a word. Dad. Her voice was pressed close to my ear, low and a little ragged at the edges. I'm really glad you're here. I just want you to know that no matter what, tonight Hey! I pulled back enough to look at her face. Her eyes were bright in a way that wasn't happiness. I put both hands on her shoulders the way I had when she was small and frightened of thunderstorms. I'm here. Everything is fine. Is it? She whispered. It will be her, I said. And I meant that too, though not in the way she was hoping. Before she could say anything else, Richard's voice carried across the yard, big and expansive, performing for the room. Sarah, bring your father over. I want him to meet Frank properly. He was already gesturing, already steering, already arranging the evening the way he arranged everything, with himself at the center and everyone else in careful orbit. Sarah's hands found my arm and squeezed once, quick and hard, the way you hold on to something before a wave hits, and then she let go. I squared my shoulders and followed her across the lawn. Richard clapped Frank Delgado on the back as I approached. Frank, you remember Harold? Sarah's father. A half-beat pause, perfectly calibrated. He used to do construction work. Retired now. Frank Delgado extended his hand. He had a good handshake, firm, practiced, and his smile was the kind that came from years of client dinners rather than anything genuine. Harold, good to meet you properly. Likewise, I said. Harold was just telling me he drove all the way from San Gabriel Valley. Richard said, though I had told him no such thing. In that pickup of his. He smiled at Frank. You've got to admire a man who holds on to things. Frank laughed. It was a smooth, social laugh, the kind that costs nothing. I looked at Richard Coleman over the rim of my glass of water. I had taken one from a passing tray, and I smiled back at him with every muscle in my face while every thought in my mind stayed perfectly, completely still. The evening had begun, and I was ready. Richard Coleman loved an audience the way a fire loves oxygen. He expanded into whatever space was given to him and consumed everything in reach. He positioned himself at the center of the patio, champagne glass raised, and the crowd gathered around him with the practiced ease of people who had done this before. 14, maybe 15 guests, all of them dressed in the language of old money and new confidence. I stood near the edge of the group with my water glass close enough to be polite, far enough to think clearly. 6 months ago. Richard began, his voice carrying the warm, self-satisfied timbre of a man delivering a sermon he had written about himself. Coleman Construction was facing the kind of headwinds that would have broken a lesser operation. Supply chain disruptions, labor shortages, 3 contracts delayed by city permitting. He shook his head with the theatrical gravity of someone describing a storm they personally defeated. But we held the line. We made the hard calls. And today I'm proud to say we have turned the corner completely. Applause rippled through the group. Frank Delgado led it, his hands coming together with the enthusiasm of a man who needed Richard to believe he believed him. I lifted my water glass and took a slow sip. What Richard did not say, what he would never say. Certainly not here. Certainly not with Frank Delgado listening and Margaret beaming from under the pergola, was that Coleman Construction had not turned any corner on its own. 6 months ago, the company had been 70 days from defaulting on 3 separate bank loans. Its largest supplier had already placed the account on credit hold. 2 of its project managers had quietly updated their resumes. It was Northbridge Capital Trust that had turned the corner for him. $22 million wired in 3 tranches over 8 weeks, structured as a secured investment, with explicit contractual conditions, full financial transparency, no personal expenditures from business accounts, employee retention requirements. David had negotiated every clause. I had approved every word. Richard had signed the agreement without reading past the first page. I know this because David told me and David had been watching. Now I watched Richard raise his glass higher and accept the small surge of admiration from his guests, and I watched the light move across the face of the watch on his left wrist. The Patek Philippe Nautilus. Reference 5711. Stainless steel olive green dial, the kind of watch that does not announce itself loudly, because it does not need to. Everyone in certain rooms already knows what it means. Retail price when you can find one somewhere between $60,000 and $80,000, depending on the market. I knew the exact purchase date. March 14th, a Friday. The wire transfer from Northbridge's first tranche had settled into Coleman Construction's operating account on March 11th. 3 days. He had waited 3 days. Something moved through my chest. Not rage, not quite, but something adjacent to it. Something with sharper edges. I pressed my thumb hard against the side of my water glass and breathed slowly and kept my face exactly where I needed it to be. Margaret appeared at Richard's elbow, touching his arm with the proprietary ease of a woman who had spent her life in her brother's shadow and learned to make that shadow comfortable. She was wearing a silk blouse the color of seafoam, her dark hair pinned at the neck. Diamond studs in her ears that I suspected were paid for by the same wire transfer that had bought Richard's watch. Harold. She said my name with a smile that was entirely surface. I didn't see you come in. How was the drive? Easy enough, I said. Oh, good. Her eyes moved over my shirt with the quick efficiency of a woman who had been raised to assess people by their presentation. You know, Richard always says Father's Day should be low-key, no need to dress up. She laughed, a light social sound. Though, of course, some of us can't help ourselves. She touched the silk lapel of her own blouse as she said it. I looked at her and smiled. You look lovely, Margaret. She blinked. She had been expecting a different reaction, and the smile reset itself with a fractional delay that most people would have missed. Thank you, Harold. How sweet. Richard drifted toward us, the champagne glass held low now, his eyes moving between my face and Margaret's, with the satisfied expression of a man who had just watched a small and entertaining drama play out exactly as predicted. "Oys, Harold." He clapped me on the shoulder, a hard, brief contact, more punctuation than warmth. "I hope you're hungry. We've got prime rib tonight. The good stuff." Another half-beat pause. "Though I imagine any meal out of the valley must feel like a treat." Frank Delgado, standing 2 feet to my left, made a sound that was almost a laugh. I turned my head and looked at Richard Coleman directly. "It does," I said pleasantly. "Thank you for having me, Richard." He searched my face for the wound he thought he had made. He didn't find it. His smile tightened just slightly at the corners, a tell I had catalogued across 4 years of family dinners, and then he turned to Frank and resumed the conversation about Coleman Construction's remarkable recovery. I turned away and looked toward the house, scanning the back door, the kitchen windows, the yard. Ethan had not come out yet. I checked my watch. Not a Patek Philippe, just a Seiko I had bought in 1987 and had serviced twice and noted the time. The sun was dropping toward the ridgeline above Bel Air, turning the sky the particular shade of amber that only Southern California manages in June, and somewhere inside that house my grandson was waiting with a card he had carried in his desk drawer since Thursday. I could wait a little longer. I heard him before I saw him. "Grandpa." The back door swung open hard enough to bounce off the doorstop, and Ethan Coleman came out of that house the way 10-year-old boys come out of houses when they have been waiting too long and can't wait anymore. At full speed, arms already reaching shoes, hitting the patio stones in a rhythm that had no interest whatsoever in being dignified. He hit me at waist height and wrapped both arms around me so tight I could feel his heartbeat through his shirt. I caught him, steadied us both, and held on. For a moment I forgot about Richard and his champagne glass and his $60,000 watch. I forgot about Linda and her pearl earrings and the careful distance she had kept from my truck. I forgot about the folder David Carter had sitting in a briefcase in Century City and the 3 tranches of wire transfers and the temporary restraining order waiting to be filed. I just held my grandson and felt the particular relief of a man who has found the one true thing in a room full of false ones. "Hey, buddy," I managed. My voice came out rougher than I intended, scraped at the edges in a way I wasn't prepared for. "There he is." Ethan pulled back just far enough to look up at me. His face flushed from running, his hair already escaping whatever his mother had done to it that morning. His eyes, dark brown, wide-set, the exact shape of his mother's, searched my face with an attention that always startled me in a child his age. "You came," he said, like he hadn't been entirely sure I would. "I told you I was coming," I said. "I know, but—" He chewed his lower lip. "Dad said it might be complicated, and sometimes when things are complicated, people don't come." That sentence hit me somewhere low in the chest. I crouched down so we were eye level, my knees protesting the way they always did on hard stone, and I put both hands on his shoulders. "Ethan." I waited until he was looking directly at me. "I will always come when you call. You understand me, always." His lower lip trembled for just a half second before he pulled it back under control, a gesture so adult and so heartbreaking that my throat tightened all over again. Then he nodded hard and fast, the way kids nod when they are trying not to need reassurance and needing it desperately anyway. "Okay," he said. "Good. Because I have your card. I've had it since Thursday, and Mom said I couldn't give it to you until dinner, but I don't think I can wait until dinner." "Then don't," I said. He looked over his shoulder at the patio, at the cluster of adults with their drinks and their conversations, then back at me. He reached into the front pocket of his dress pants, He was wearing a button-down shirt and dark slacks, dressed up in the way children are dressed up when adults want them to perform, being small adults, and pulled out a piece of paper that had been folded and unfolded enough times to have gone soft at the creases. He held it out with both hands. I took it carefully the way you take something that matters. The drawing was in pencil and blue crayon, two figures on a dock, one tall and one small, both holding fishing rods, both leaning slightly toward each other the way people lean when they are comfortable with the silence between them. In the sky above them, in handwriting that was still working out the difference between printing and cursive, it said, "For the best, Grandpa. Don't let them make you small." I read it twice. My eyes burned. I pressed my lips together hard and looked up at the amber sky above the roofline of the Coleman estate for a long moment, blinking against something I refused to let go of in this backyard in front of these people. Ethan. My voice was not steady. I did not try to make it steady. This is the best thing anyone has given me in a very long time. He beamed the full, unguarded beam of a child who has made someone happy and knows it and wants to live inside that moment for as long as possible. I worked on the fishing rods for a really long time, he said earnestly. They were hard. They look exactly right, I told him. I folded the drawing along its original creases carefully and tucked it into the breast pocket of my shirt right over my heart. Ethan watched me do it with enormous satisfaction. Then his face shifted just slightly, a shadow moving across it. He stepped closer and dropped his voice to a near whisper, glancing back toward the patio again. "Grandpa, can I tell you something?" "Anything," I said. "I don't think tonight is going to be very fun." He said it with the grave, matter-of-fact certainty of a child who has been paying closer attention to the adults around him than any of them realized. Grandpa Richard gets really loud sometimes at dinner, and Dad gets quiet when Grandpa Richard gets loud. And I don't. He stopped. His small hands found the lapels of my shirt and gripped them lightly. "I don't want anyone to be mean to you." "Okay, you're my grandpa. You're not supposed to have people be mean to you." I covered his hands with mine. This boy. This extraordinary, clear-eyed 10-year-old boy. "Tell you what," I said. "You let me worry about the grown-up stuff tonight. Your job is just to sit next to me at dinner and tell me about school. Can you do that?" He considered this with genuine seriousness, the way he considered everything. Then, "I'm doing really well in math. I would expect nothing less." He grinned, reached up and grabbed my hand. "Come on. Mom said we're eating in 20 minutes, and Grandpa Richard already moved your seat twice." I let him lead me back across the patio, his small hand warm and certain in mine, past the string lights and the white linen tables and the people with their champagne glasses. Richard Coleman watched us cross the yard. I could feel his gaze on the back of my neck like a hand pressing down. I did not turn around. I was holding something more valuable than anything in that backyard. The dining room of the Coleman estate was the kind of room that had been designed to make certain people feel important, and certain other people feel the opposite. A mahogany table ran the length of the space, draped in white linen, so crisp it looked like it had never been touched. Sterling silver cutlery. Crystal glasses that caught the chandelier light and threw small rainbows across the walls. A centerpiece of white orchids down the middle, each bloom deliberate and perfect, and entirely without warmth. The room smelled like money and fresh flowers and the faint underlying anxiety of people trying very hard to perform a version of themselves. They weren't sure they could sustain all evening. Richard stood at the head of the table directing traffic. "Frank, you're here. Yes, right there. Margaret next to Frank. Sarah, sweetheart, you and Daniel are in the center." He moved through the seating arrangements with the efficiency of a man who had decided everything in advance and was now simply executing the plan. His eyes moved to me. "Harold." A brief pause. "We'll put you down at the end. More room to stretch out." More room to stretch out. I looked at the chair he was indicating, the far end of the table nearest the door to the kitchen, where the servers would be moving in and out all evening, closest to the noise, furthest from the conversation. "Of course," I said. "Thank you, Richard." Ethan's hand tightened in mine. Then he pulled me toward the indicated chair, sat down next to me, and crossed his arms with the air of a person who had made a decision and was not interested in discussing it. Richard's jaw shifted. "Ethan, there's a seat saved for you next to your grandmother Linda up here." "I want to sit with Grandpa Harold," Ethan said. His voice was polite and utterly immovable, the way children's voices are when they have decided something with their whole heart. "Ethan." Sarah's voice carried a soft warning from across the table. "Mom, I want to sit with Grandpa Harold." He looked up at her directly without flinching. "Grandpa Richard moved his seat twice already. That's not very nice." The table went very still. Several guests found sudden interest in their water glasses. Frank Delgado cleared his throat. Margaret pressed her lips together and looked at the centerpiece. Richard's smile stayed exactly in place, but something behind his eyes sharpened to a point. "Kids," Hugh said to the table at large with a laugh that invited everyone to find this charming. Several people obliged. Daniel, seated halfway down the table, had not laughed. I noticed that. He was watching his son with an expression I couldn't immediately name, something between pride and terror. The face of a man who recognized courage in someone smaller than himself and didn't know what to do with the recognition. Sarah reached over and touched Daniel's arm. He covered her hand with his, but kept his eyes down, staring at his empty plate like it contained instructions he was trying to memorize. The servers began moving through the room, pouring water, setting bread baskets. I unfolded my napkin and laid it across my lap and looked down the length of the table at Richard Coleman, who was now deep in conversation with Frank Delgado, performing the ease of a man completely in control. Ethan leaned toward me and whispered, "I told you he moved your seat twice." "I know, buddy," I said quietly. "The first time he put you by the window. Then he moved you to the corner. Then here." His brow furrowed with the focused disapproval of a child who has absorbed more than adults intended. "Why does he keep doing that?" I looked at my grandson, this boy with his mother's eyes and his too big dress shirt, and his absolutely uncompromised sense of what was fair, and I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger, not resignation. Something closer to clarity. "Some people think where you sit tells everyone something about who you are," I said. Ethan considered this with great seriousness. "That's dumb," he concluded. "It is," I agreed. He reached under the table and patted my hand once firmly in the manner of someone offering reassurance to a person who needed it, and then straightened up and reached for his bread roll with the focused energy of a boy who had said what he needed to say and was now ready for dinner. I reached for my water glass. Across the table, I caught Daniel's eyes for just a moment. He looked away first fast, like a man who had been caught seeing something he wasn't supposed to see. His hands were wrapped around his own water glass knuckles, showing white at the joints, and his jaw was working in a slow, grinding way that told me he was carrying something heavy tonight. Something he hadn't put down yet. Something he might not be able to carry much longer. The first course was a butternut squash soup that arrived in white bowls so thin you could see light through them. It was excellent. I know because I tasted it carefully and made a point of noticing the way you make a point of finding solid ground when everything around you is shifting. Richard had moved into his element. There is a particular kind of man who becomes more himself at his own dinner table, louder, more expansive, more certain of his right to fill every silence with the sound of his own voice. Richard Coleman was that kind of man perfected. He talked about a new mixed-use development in Santa Monica that Coleman Construction had been shortlisted for. He talked about a charity golf tournament he was co-hosting in August at Riviera Country Club. He talked about the renovation of his Cabo San Lucas property, which had apparently required importing specific tiles from a particular region of Portugal, because no domestic option had met his standards. Frank Delgado contributed enthusiastically. Margaret refilled her wine glass with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had learned to make social events survivable through incremental chemistry. Linda sat across the table from me, laughing at the right moments, asking the right questions, her pearl earrings catching the chandelier light every time she turned her head toward Richard to show him he had her full attention. She had not looked at me once since we sat down. I ate my soup. I listened. I watched. Harold. Richard's voice cut across the table with the precision of a man who had chosen his moment. You did some work on commercial projects back in the day, didn't you? Poured foundation on a few buildings downtown. Every head at the table turned toward me with the careful social attention of people who could sense a performance beginning and weren't sure yet whether it would be comedy or something else. 40 years in construction, I said. Started as a laborer, finished as a foreman. We worked on everything from residential foundations to high-rise commercial. Foreman. Richard nodded slowly, turning the word over like he was examining something he'd found at the bottom of a drawer. So you were what, managing the crew, making sure people showed up on time, that kind of thing? Project coordination, safety compliance reading, structural plans, managing subcontractors, keeping jobs on schedule and under budget. I kept my voice even and pleasant. That kind of thing. He picked up his wine glass. I always say the backbone of any project is the man in the field, the unsung hero. He smiled at Frank. Of course, the vision comes from somewhere else entirely. Frank Delgado chuckled and reached for his own glass. My jaw tightened exactly once. I released it. Ethan, seated beside me, had stopped eating his soup. He was looking at Richard with an expression of open, unfiltered assessment that children deploy when they have not yet learned to disguise what they think of what they are hearing. His spoon hovered over his bowl, forgotten. I touched his arm lightly under the table. He looked at me. I gave a small shake of my head. He went back to his soup, but his shoulders stayed up near his ears, rigid with the effort of a child swallowing something that tasted wrong. Margaret leaned forward from her seat, her wineglass cradled in both hands. Her eyes bright with the particular energy of someone who has been warming up for this. Harold, I have to ask, what does a retired construction foreman do with his time? I imagine it must be quite a change of pace. All that quiet. I read, I said. I cook. I fish with my grandson when we can manage it. How lovely. She said it the way people say how quaint. Richard always says retirement is wasted on people who never learned to enjoy leisure. But I suppose everyone finds their own way. She tilted her head. Do you travel at all? Or is that, I mean, on a fixed income, I imagine travel becomes a bit. She made a small, sympathetic gesture with her wineglass that managed to contain an entire sentence she hadn't technically said. I get where I need to go, I said. She smiled. Of course you do. The soup bowls were cleared. The main course arrived prime rib, as Richard had promised, served on plates that were warm to the touch. The servers moved around the table with quiet efficiency, and I watched Richard track their movements with the proprietorial attention of a man who needed everything in his sight line to confirm his importance. Frank Delgado raised his glass. "Richard, I have to say this might be the best Father's Day spread I've seen. You always do it right." Richard accepted this with a broad, satisfied smile, the smile of a man being given exactly what he believed he deserved. "Family comes first," he said. "That's always been our way." He looked down the table as he said it. Right at me. I held his gaze across the white linen and the crystal glasses and the white orchids and every careful, deliberate foot of distance he had engineered between us, and I smiled back at him with all the warmth I could locate in that moment. "Couldn't agree more, Richard," I said. He searched my face the way he always did, hunting for the wound. His eyes moved to the breast pocket of my shirt, to the slight rectangular shape there, the folded paper Ethan had given me. Something shifted in his expression. Not softness, more like recognition. He looked away first. Under the table, Ethan's knee pressed against mine. Just pressure, just contact. Just his way of saying, "I'm here and I see it too, and you are not alone in this room." I reached for my water glass and breathed and waited for whatever was coming next. "You've seen everything Harold has endured tonight. The comments, the seat at the far end of the table, the looks, and it's not over yet. Before I tell you what happens next, drop a 'still here' in the comments. Let me know you're with us. And tell me, do you think anyone at that table is going to stand up for him?" One more thing. Parts of this story include fictional elements shaped for depth and storytelling. If that's not your kind of content, this is a good moment to step away. No hard feelings at all. It started with the prime rib. A server set the carving station near the center of the table, and the platter of bone-in ribs, dark at the edges, glistening, the kind of cut that costs more per pound than most people spend on a full grocery run, landed closest to the end of the table where Ethan and I were sitting. Not by my design, simply by the geometry of the room, the length of the table, the position of the kitchen door. I had not touched it. I was listening to Ethan tell me about his science project, something involving water filtration and activated charcoal, that he had clearly thought about more deeply than his teacher had anticipated when I became aware of Richard moving. He came around the side of the table with the deliberate speed of a man who had decided something and was not going to let anything interrupt the deciding. He reached past me, his sleeve brushing my shoulder, and pulled the carving platter toward himself with both hands. "I'll take care of this," he announced to the table. "Harold, you don't mind, do you? This end of the table's a little out of the way for the good cuts." Every person at that table heard it. Every person understood it. I set my fork down. Slowly. Carefully. The way you set something down when you need both hands free and your mind clear. "I hadn't touched it, Richard," I said. My voice came out level and quiet, the way my voice got when I was working very hard to keep it that way. "The server put it there. I was talking to my grandson." Richard lifted the platter and turned back toward the center of the table. Of course," he said, with the breezy dismissal of a man who had already won the exchange in his own mind. "Just making sure everyone gets a fair share. You understand?" "I understand perfectly," I said. Something in my tone made him stop. He turned back. His eyes found mine across the table, and what he saw there, I don't know exactly what he saw, but it was enough to shift something in the room. The conversations around us faded to a lower register. Frank Delgado put his wine glass down. Margaret went very still. "Is there a problem, Harold?" Richard's voice had taken on a new texture. Still smooth, but with something underneath it. Now something that had been waiting all evening for a reason to surface. "No problem," I said. "I'm a guest in your home. I'm here to have dinner with my daughter and my grandson on Father's Day. That's all I've ever been here for, right?" He set the platter back down on the table hard, the silver ringing against the wood, and straightened to his full height. His face had gone the particular shade of red that comes not from embarrassment, but from the specific fury of a man who expected deference and received dignity instead. "Because I want to be very clear about something, Harold. This is my house. This is my table. And the people sitting at it contribute to this family in meaningful ways." Sarah's chair scraped back half an inch. Daniel's hand shot out and caught her arm. "Dad!" Daniel's voice was low, strained, the voice of a man standing at the edge of something he could see the bottom of. "Stay out of it, Daniel." Richard didn't look at his son. His eyes were locked on me. "I'm talking to Harold." He came around the table then. Not quickly, slowly, with the terrible patience of a man who had never once been stopped. He stopped beside my chair. I could feel the heat coming off him, the barely contained pressure of it, the way you feel a summer storm before the first drop falls. "So, you want to sit at my table?" His voice had dropped low and intimate and ugly. "You want to eat my food and sit in my chairs and breathe my air, then you show some respect. You remember who built all of this, and you remember that a man who spent his life pouring other people's concrete doesn't get to look at me like that." I looked up at him from my chair. I did not stand. I did not raise my voice. "I'm looking at you the only way I know how, Richard," I said. "Straight." He hit me. It was not a slap, so much as a strike the back of his hand across my left cheek, hard enough that my head turned with it, hard enough that I tasted copper at the corner of my mouth, and the chandelier light swam for a moment at the edges of my vision. The sound of it cracked through the dining room like something breaking that could not be unbroken. Nobody moved. Sarah made a sound, a sharp, wounded sound, her hand flying to her mouth. Daniel was on his feet, but frozen, his face the color of chalk, his hands gripping the edge of the table like the floor had dropped away beneath him. Linda stood up from her chair. My heart lifted for one single second. Then she looked at me, at my reddening cheek, at the water in my eyes I was refusing to let fall, and she said in a voice that shook only slightly, "Harold, apologize to Richard. Right now. Let's not make this any worse than it already is." The lifting stopped. Something heavier took its place. I pressed the back of my hand to the corner of my mouth. Looked at the faint smear of red there. Looked at Richard, who was standing over me, breathing hard, righteous and enormous, and entirely certain he had just established something important. Looked at Linda, who was still watching me with that expression. Not cruelty, which would have been easier, but fear dressed up as practicality, the face of a woman choosing the path she believed would cost her least. Looked at my daughter, who had both hands over her mouth, and tears running down her face and couldn't seem to make herself move. Looked at Daniel, who was shaking visibly, physically, shaking, and staring at his father like he was seeing something he had known was there for a long time, and had spent a long time hoping he was wrong about. I reached into my breast pocket, touched the folded edge of Ethan's drawing, just touched it. Then I pushed my chair back, stood up, and picked up the small gift box I had brought for Daniel from the floor beside my chair. I turned toward the door. I was not going to apologize. I was not going to argue. I was going to walk out of this room with the same spine I had walked in with. I had taken 4 steps toward the door when the chair scraped. Not an adult chair, the lighter, sharper sound of a child's chair, shoved back hard against marble floor. Then footsteps fast and uneven, and then Ethan's arms were around my waist from behind, both of them locked tight, his face pressed into my back, between my shoulder blades, and he was crying in the way children cry when they have held it as long as they possibly can and cannot hold it 1 second more, in great, heaving, chest-deep sobs that shook his whole body against mine. I stopped walking. "Don't go." His voice was muffled against my shirt, broken apart by crying. "Grandpa, please don't go. Please." My hand came up and covered both of his, where they were clasped at my stomach. I could feel him shaking. 10 years old and shaking like the ground had gone out from under him, and every single adult in that room had let it happen. "Ethan!" Sarah's voice raw and desperate. "Baby, come back to your seat, come on!" No. He lifted his face just enough to be heard clearly, his voice cracking down the middle. "No, Mom. I'm not going back." He let go of me, then released my waist and stepped around to put himself between me and the rest of the room. He was so small standing there. Dress shirt untucked now, face red and wet chin jutting forward with a courage that made my chest feel like it was being compressed from both sides. He pointed at Richard. His hand was trembling, but it did not waver. "You hit my grandpa." His voice broke on the last word, and he pushed through it anyway. "You hit him and nobody did anything. Mom didn't do anything. Dad didn't do anything." His eyes swept the table. Frank Delgado, Margaret, the other guests, all of them frozen, all of them suddenly very interested in the middle distance. "Nobody did anything. Ethan, that is enough." Richard's voice came out harder than he intended, and he knew it because his next words came out softer, coated in false patience. "Come sit down. The adults are handling this." "You're not handling it." Ethan's voice rose clear and furious and heartbroken all at once. "You hit him and then you told him to say sorry. That's not handling it. That's wrong. That is just wrong." He turned to his mother. His face crumpled for a moment, and then steadied again, the way a candle flame steadies after a hand passes too close. "Mom." His voice dropped. "You always told me that when someone hurts someone you love, you stand up. You always said that. You said it to me when Tyler pushed me down at recess, and you said it when Dad's friend said something mean about our car, and you have said it my whole life." His lower lip was trembling violently, now tears running freely down his face. "So why isn't anybody standing up for Grandpa?" Sarah pressed both hands over her mouth. Her shoulders were shaking. She made a sound behind her hands that was not quite a word. Daniel took one step forward, then stopped. His father's eyes cut to him like a blade, and Daniel stopped, and I watched something in him die a little, and then slowly, visibly, painfully begin to come back. Richard pointed at Ethan. "Daniel, get your son and sit him down. Now." Daniel looked at his father. Then he looked at Ethan, this 10-year-old boy standing in the wreckage of a dinner party with his shirt untucked and his face soaked, and his hand still pointed at the man who had just struck his grandfather, and something shifted in Daniel's face. Something that had been locked for a long time came open. He did not move toward Ethan to bring him back to the table. I crouched down in front of my grandson. My knees ached, and I did not care. I took his face in both hands, these big, scarred construction foreman hands, around this small, wet, furious face, and I waited until his eyes found mine. "You are the bravest person in this room," I told him. "Do you hear me? The bravest person in this room." His face broke completely then. He grabbed my wrists and cried hard and full, the way you cry when someone finally says the true thing out loud. I pulled him close and held him and looked up over his shoulder at Richard Coleman. And I reached into my pocket for my phone. I dialed David Carter's number from memory. He picked up on the second ring the way he always did. David Carter did not let phones ring more than twice on principle, a habit he had developed over 30 years of practicing law and never quite shaken. "Harold." His voice was measured, alert. He had been waiting. "Activate the final option," I said. "Bring everything to the Coleman estate, now." A pause, not hesitation. Just David processing shifting gears with the efficiency of a man who had been holding a loaded plan in both hands for 2 months and was now being told to set it down on the table. "We're 20 minutes out," he said. "Are you all right?" I looked down at Ethan, who had his face pressed against my shoulder. His breathing still ragged and uneven, hitching every few seconds, with the aftershocks of hard crying. I pressed my hand flat against the back of his head. "I will be," I said. 20 minutes. I ended the call and straightened up. The dining room had not moved. It had the quality of a photograph, taken at the exact wrong moment, everyone caught mid-expression, mid-breath, mid-decision. Frank Delgado had both hands flat on the table. Margaret was gripping her wine glass so tightly I could see the tension in her knuckles from across the room. The other guests had arranged themselves into the careful stillness of people who understood they were witnessing something they would be asked about later and were not yet sure what their answer would be. Richard broke first. He let out a short, sharp laugh, the laugh of a man who needed the room to believe he found something funny. "Calling your lawyer, Harold, really?" He looked at Frank, inviting him to share in the absurdity. Frank did not oblige. His eyes stayed on the table. Richard's smile thinned. "You're going to lawyer up over a family dinner, over what a disagreement?" "It wasn't a disagreement, Richard," I said. "You provoked, you struck me." My voice came out quiet and precise, each word separate and deliberate, the way you lay foundation one piece at a time. Nothing rushed, everything level. "In your dining room, in front of your grandchild and mine. That is what happened. There is no other version." Richard's jaw worked. The red had come back into his face, deeper now, the particular shade of a man whose narrative was being taken from him in public. Linda stepped toward me. Her heels clicked twice on the marble, and then she stopped close enough that I could see the mascara starting to track at the corner of her right eye. She reached for my arm. "Harold, please." Her voice was low and urgent and frightened. "Don't do this. Whatever you're planning, just stop. Come sit down. We can talk about this like adults, we can, Linda." I looked at her. Directly, without anger, without anything sharp. Just looked. "I need you to step back." She flinched, like I had raised my voice, though I hadn't. "Harold, I am your wife." "I know who you are." I said it gently. "Step back, please." She stepped back. Her hand fell to her side. Something moved across her face that she couldn't quite contain. Not grief exactly, but the first tremor of something that would become grief later, when she was alone and had time to understand what she had chosen tonight and what it had cost her. Sarah had come around the table. She stopped a few feet from me, her arms wrapped around her own waist, holding herself together, the way people do when they are afraid that if they let go, they will come apart entirely. Her face was stripped of everything practiced and social and careful, just raw, open, the face of a daughter who had watched something happen and had not stopped it and could not unknow that about herself. "Dad," she said. Her voice cracked straight down the middle. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I should have... Not now, sweetheart." I reached out and touched her cheek with one hand, quick and gentle. "Later. I promise. Not now." Daniel had not moved from his position at the table. He was standing with both hands gripping the back of his chair. His knuckles white, his eyes fixed on me with an expression that had passed through fear and come out the other side into something harder and cleaner. He was breathing through his nose in slow, deliberate pulls, the way men breathe when they are making a decision they know they cannot take back. Richard turned to his son. "Daniel." Tell your father-in-law to put the phone away and sit down before he does something he can't undo." Daniel looked at his father. He looked at the man who had raised him, who had built the company he worked for, who had handed him a life pre-assembled, and told him to be grateful for the shape of it. He looked at him for a long moment, and whatever he was looking for, he either found it or stopped needing to find it, because his hands released the chair back, and he straightened up and he said very quietly, "No." Richard blinked. "What did you just say to me?" I said no. Daniel's voice gathered itself, grew steadier with each word, like a man finding his footing on uncertain ground, one step at a time. "I'm not going to tell him that. I'm not going to tell him anything except—" He stopped, looked at Harold. His eyes were wet, but his jaw was set. "I'm sorry. For all of it. For every dinner. For every time I looked the other way." His voice dropped. I knew what he was doing. I didn't know all of it, but I knew enough. And I looked the other way. The room held its breath. Richard's face went through 5 expressions in 3 seconds. He landed on fury. "You ungrateful, don't." Daniel said it like a door closing. Final, irreversible. Outside on the long, pale driveway, headlights swept across the dining room windows. 3 sets of them. Moving slowly, deliberately, the way things move when they have arrived exactly on time. Richard Coleman just laughed when Harold made that phone call. He called it a bluff. He called it the desperate move of a man with nothing left to play. Before I show you what walks through that front door, type "I knew it" or "no way" in the comments. Because what happens in the next 60 seconds changes everything. A note. Some elements here are fictional, built for storytelling and impact. If this type of content isn't right for you, feel free to step away. I'll see the rest of you on the other side. The front door opened without anyone knocking. David Carter walked into the Coleman estate the way he walked into every room that mattered, without hurry, without theater, with the particular quality of stillness that belongs to men who have spent decades being the most prepared person present. He wore a dark suit, no tie, a briefcase of worn black leather in his left hand. Behind him came 2 attorneys from his firm, then an independent forensic accountant named Victor Reyes, whose work I had been relying on for 15 years. Then a representative from Pacific Coast Bank, a senior risk officer named James Whitfield, who had flown in from San Francisco that afternoon, and finally Tom Briggs Coleman Construction's own chief financial officer, a thin, careful man of 48, who had been carrying the weight of what he knew for 8 weeks and looked like it. They filed into the dining room in a line, and the room changed the moment they crossed the threshold. The air pressure shifted. Something that had felt like Richard Coleman's territory 30 seconds ago stopped feeling that way. David walked directly to me. He stopped, looked at my face, at the mark still visible on my cheek, and his expression did not change, but something behind his eyes went very cold and very focused. He turned to face the room. "Good evening." His voice carried to every corner without effort. "My name is David Carter. I represent Northbridge Capital Trust." A pause exactly long enough. "I'm here on behalf of the trust's founder and sole beneficial owner." He turned slightly toward me. "Chairman Bennett." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full-packed with the sound of 14 people simultaneously revising everything they thought they knew. Richard's champagne glass. He had picked it up again somewhere in the last 20 minutes. The reflexive armor of a man who needed something to hold, tilted in his hand. He caught it. Steadied it. His eyes moved from David to me and back to David with the rapid, calculating movement of a man running numbers that weren't adding up. "Chairman." He said the word like it was in a foreign language. "Harold Bennett is a retired construction foreman. He drove here in a pickup truck from San Gabriel Valley." His voice was still trying for dismissive, but the edges of it had started to fray. "What exactly are you claiming?" David set his briefcase on the end of the dining table, my end, the end nearest the kitchen door, the end Richard had assigned to me, and opened it with 2 clean clicks. Northbridge Capital Trust is a Delaware-registered investment trust with assets under management exceeding $300 million, David said. 6 months ago, at Mr. Bennett's direction, the trust extended a secured investment of $22 million to Coleman Construction LLC, structured across 3 tranches with explicit contractual conditions governing the use of those funds. He removed a bound document and set it on the table. Mr. Bennett is the trust's founder. He has been its sole beneficial owner for 22 years. He is and has always been the individual you've been doing business with. Frank Delgado put both hands flat on the table and stared at the document. Margaret made a sound, a short, involuntary intake of breath, and pressed her fingers to her lips. Linda had backed up until she was standing against the wall. Her pearl earrings caught the light as her head moved slowly from side to side. Not disagreement, just the physical manifestation of a mind refusing to accept new information. Richard's face went through the full sequence. Confusion, disbelief, the desperate scrambling search for an angle. Then, as David laid a second document beside the first, and a third beside that something that looked almost like the first physical symptom of real fear. "This is..." He stopped, restarted. "This is some kind of... Mr. Coleman." David's voice was not unkind. It was simply immovable. "I'd encourage you to listen carefully to what comes next." Tom Briggs stepped forward. He had the posture of a man who had been folded in half for 2 months and was now painfully straightening. His voice shook on the first word and then steadied. "I've been the CFO of Coleman Construction for 11 years, he said. "And for the past 8 I've been compiling documentation of financial irregularities that I am prepared to present in full." He looked at Richard, not with anger, with something sadder and more final. "I tried twice to raise these concerns internally. I was told to let it go." He set a USB drive on the table beside David's documents. "I did not let it go." Richard's hand came down on the table, hard. The crystal glasses jumped. "Tom, you have no idea what you're..." "He knows exactly what he's doing," David said. He opened the next document and turned it to face the room. "As do I. As does Mr. Bennett. And as I suspect, do you." I had not moved from my position near the door. Ethan was beside me, his hand in mine, his crying quieted now into something watchful and still. I felt him squeeze my fingers. I looked at Richard Coleman, this man in his navy blazer and his $60,000 watch in his house that was no longer entirely his, and I felt nothing that resembled satisfaction. What I felt was closer to the particular exhaustion that comes at the end of something that has been going on too long. And I felt beneath that the steady, quiet certainty of a foundation that has been tested and has held. "Chichirdakum," I said. My voice came out tired and even and clear. "I came here tonight to give you one last opportunity to do the right thing, to come forward, to make it right with Daniel before it went any further." I looked at the documents spread across the white linen tablecloth, across the crystal and the cold prime rib and the white orchids. "You chose differently." Richard opened his mouth. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. The color left his face so completely and so quickly that Frank Delgado, standing 2 feet away, actually took a step toward him, as if he might need catching. Richard's phone rang again, and again, and again. Richard stared at his phone screen, the way a man stares at something he has been dreading for months, and has somehow still managed to be surprised by. He answered it. I watched his face as he listened, watched it go from red to white to a gray that had no name. And then he lowered the phone without saying goodbye to whoever was on the other end and stood there with it hanging in his hand like something he no longer knew how to use. That was the board, he said. To no one in particular. To the room. To the white orchids and the cold prime rib and the crystal glasses and the ruins of the dinner party he had been so certain of 3 hours ago. The board of directors. He looked up at David. You contacted my board. The forensic report was delivered to all 12 board members at 7:45 this evening, David said. Along with the documentation Mr. Briggs provided and the findings of our independent audit. He removed another bound report from his briefcase and set it on the table. This is a summary of those findings. I'll walk you through the significant points. Richard's phone rang again. He rejected the call. David opened the report. Over a period of 4 months following the first Northbridge capital tranche, he said, his voice carrying the flat, precise energy of a man reading a verdict. He wrote himself, $3,400,000 was transferred from Coleman Construction's operating account to a consulting firm registered in Nevada under the name Crestline Advisory Group. He looked up. Crestline Advisory Group was incorporated 14 days after the first wire transfer from Northbridge. Its sole registered officer is Margaret Ann Coleman. Every head in the room turned toward Margaret. She had put her wine glass down. Both hands were in her lap, pressed flat against her thighs, and her face had arranged itself into an expression of careful neutrality that was costing her enormous effort to maintain. When the room looked at her, her chin came up, reflex, not confidence. That is a private business arrangement between myself and my brother, she said. Her voice came out steadier than I expected. It is entirely legal. The arrangement itself may be legal, David said. The source of the funds is not. The investment agreement between Northbridge Capital and Coleman Construction explicitly prohibits the use of invested capital for any purpose other than operational expenses, debt service, and approved capital expenditures. Transfers to a related party consulting firm with no documented services rendered constitute misappropriation of invested funds. He turned the page. That is a breach of contract, and given the use of wire transfers across state lines a matter of federal interest. Margaret's carefully maintained expression developed a crack along the left side. She pressed her lips together and looked at the table. David continued. Additionally, Coleman Construction's financial records show $47,000 in charges to the company's American Express corporate account over a 4-month period. These charges include a Patek Philippe Nautilus purchased from an authorized dealer in Beverly Hills on March 14th, 2 first-class flights to Cabo San Lucas hotel charges at the Esperanza Resort, and renovation costs at this property. He glanced up at the ceiling of the dining room, the new coffered ceiling, the recessed lighting, the finish work that had not been here 18 months ago. All charged to the business. None authorized under the investment agreement. Frank Delgado pushed his chair back from the table. The legs scraped against the marble with a sound like something tearing. Richard. Frank's voice had lost every trace of the smooth, social warmth it had carried all evening. I need to call my attorney. Frank, I'm sorry. Frank held up one hand, palm out. I'm sorry, but I need to call my attorney right now. He picked up his phone and walked out of the dining room without looking back, his footsteps quick and purposeful on the marble floor. Richard watched him go. Something in his posture changed a degree of collapse, barely visible, like a building that has lost one load-bearing element and has not yet fallen but will. There is one additional matter, David said. He removed the last document from his briefcase. He set it on the table and turned it to face the room. It was a single page. A transaction authorization form for Coleman Construction, bearing Daniel's name, Daniel's title, and what appeared to be Daniel's electronic signature, authorizing a wire transfer of $800,000 to Crestline Advisory Group. Dated 6 weeks ago. Daniel had been in Portland 6 weeks ago. I knew this because Sarah had told me, because Ethan had complained about his father missing his school presentation. Sarah looked at the document. Then she looked at her husband. Her face did the thing faces do when understanding arrives too fast to flinch. Then stillness. Then the slow, terrible clarity of a woman realizing the shape of something that has been in her house the whole time. Daniel. Her voice was barely above a breath. That's your signature. Why is your signature on that? Daniel crossed the room in 4 steps, picked up the document with both hands, and stared at it. His breathing had gone shallow and audible. His hands were shaking badly enough that the paper trembled. I was in Portland, he said. I was in Portland when this was dated. I never... He looked at his father. His voice cracked open. I never signed this. Dad, I was in Portland. I never signed this. Richard said nothing. That nothing was the loudest thing in the room. Daniel's hands tightened on the document until the edges crumpled in his grip. His eyes filled not with grief, not yet, but with the specific burning devastation of a son who has just been shown in a single page what his father thought of him. You were going to let me take this, Daniel said. His voice was barely controlled, vibrating at the edges like a wire pulled too tight. You forged my signature. You were going to let me go down for this. A sound escaped him, not quite a word, not quite a sob, somewhere between the two. I have a son, Dad. I have a 10-year-old son. Richard's mouth opened, closed. Tom Briggs, standing quietly against the wall, reached into his jacket pocket and produced a second USB drive. He set it on the table beside David's documents. That contains the metadata from the electronic signature platform, Tom said. Timestamp IP address device ID. It will confirm the signature was not made from any device registered to Daniel Coleman. He looked at Richard one final time, the look of a man closing a door he had stood in front of for a long time. I'm sorry it took me this long. The document was still shaking in Daniel's hands. Not because he was weak. I understood that now, watching him stand there in the wreckage of his father's dinner party, with his dress shirt damp at the collar, and his eyes red, and his whole body vibrating with the effort of processing something that had no good edges to grab onto. Daniel Coleman was not a weak man. He was a man who had spent years making himself smaller to fit inside a life his father had built for him, and the cost of that had just been laid out on a white linen tablecloth in front of everyone he loved. Richard had not moved. He stood at the head of the table, his table in his house at his dinner, and he watched his son with an expression I could not entirely read. Not remorse. Not quite. Something more defensive than that. The look of a man constructing an argument in real time, sorting through available justifications, testing each one for structural integrity. Daniel. His voice came out low and careful. Put that down. We need to talk privately before you do anything you can't. Before I do anything? Daniel's voice broke on the last word and came back harder. He set the document on the table carefully, deliberately, like he was setting down something explosive, and turned to face his father fully. You forged my name, Dad. You put my name on a transfer I didn't authorize, and you dated it when you knew I was in Portland, and you... He stopped, pressed the back of his hand against his mouth for a moment. His chest was heaving. You were going to let me take the fall for this. That was the plan. If this came apart, I was going to be the one standing in front of a federal judge, not you. That is not, don't. The word came out of Daniel with a force that surprised the room. His hands had stopped shaking. Something had clarified in him, the particular stillness that arrives on the other side of the worst moment, when there is nothing left to brace for because the thing you were dreading has already happened. Don't tell me what it is and isn't. I can read. I've been reading contracts for you for 11 years, and I can read what's on that page. Sarah crossed the room and stood beside her husband. She did not touch him. She just stood there, shoulder to shoulder, her face stripped of everything except a devastated, clear-eyed solidarity that made my chest ache to look at. Richard looked at his son and his daughter-in-law standing together, and something shifted in his face, the briefest flicker of something that might in a different man have been the beginning of remorse. It did not last. Everything I have done, he said, drawing himself up, has been for this family, for your future, for son. Stop. Sarah's voice was quiet and absolute. Please stop. Daniel turned away from his father. He looked at David Carter. If I cooperate fully, he said. His voice was steady now, the steadiness of a man making a decision he has thought through to its conclusion. If I provide everything I have, emails, documents, contracts, he made me sign without explaining what they were for. What does that mean for me legally? David glanced at me. I gave the smallest nod. Full cooperation with the federal investigation significantly reduces your exposure, David said. Given that the forensic metadata confirms the forged signature, and given that you have no documented financial benefit from any of the transactions in question, the United States Attorney's Office would very likely offer you a non-prosecution agreement in exchange for your testimony and documentation. He paused. I can have our firm represent you through that process at no cost if you choose to proceed. Daniel breathed in through his nose, out through his mouth. Once. I have emails going back 4 months, he said. I have physical documents he gave me to sign that I kept copies of because something felt wrong and I didn't know what to do about it. His voice cracked again, just slightly. I should have done something sooner. I know that. I knew something was wrong and I was scared and He stopped, looked at Sarah. She reached over and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his, holding on. I should have done something sooner, he said again, quieter to her rather than the room. Daniel. Richard's voice had changed completely. The authority had drained out of it, replaced by something thinner and more desperate. The voice of a man who has just watched his last option walk across the room and stand on the other side. Son, think about what you're doing. Think about this family. Think about, I am thinking about this family. Daniel looked at his father one last time. His eyes were wet, but his voice was iron. I'm thinking about Ethan. I'm thinking about what I want him to understand about what a man does when he has to choose between what's easy and what's right. He turned back to David. Tell me what you need. I had not spoken. I had watched this unfold the way you watch something you built perform under load, not with pride exactly, but with the quiet, exhausted relief of knowing the foundation held. I felt a small hand press into mine. Ethan had come to stand beside me at some point. In the last few minutes, I had not seen him move. Only suddenly, he was there, his shoulder against my arm, his fingers wrapped around 2 of mine, the way they had been on the dock in the drawing he had made me. I looked down at him. His face was serious and very young and very old at the same time, the way children's faces get when they have witnessed something that has permanently expanded their understanding of the world. Is Dad going to be okay? He whispered. I squeezed his fingers. Yes, I said. Your dad is going to be okay. Across the table, Richard Coleman pulled out a chair and sat down heavily, as if his legs had simply decided they were done. He put both hands over his face. Nobody went to him. Richard's phone had not stopped ringing. He sat at the head of his table with his hands over his face and his phone lighting up beside his plate. Call after call after call, the screen flashing names he had spent years cultivating, board members and lenders and project partners who had heard something tonight that could not be unheard. He did not answer. After the fourth call, he picked it up and turned it face down on the linen, and the white tablecloth glowed faintly with each new incoming call, like something alive and insistent beneath the surface. David stepped away from the table and spoke briefly with James Whitfield, the Pacific Coast Bank representative, a quiet exchange professional and efficient, the kind of conversation that sounds like nothing and means everything. When David came back, he looked at me and gave a single nod. The bank has initiated a freeze on Coleman Construction's operating account and all associated lines of credit pending the outcome of the federal review. He said for the room rather than just for me. This is standard procedure when a suspicious activity report has been filed. It does not constitute a finding of guilt. It means the funds are protected while the investigation proceeds. Richard lifted his face from his hands. His eyes were dry but red at the rims, and the certainty that had lived in them all evening, that absolute load-bearing certainty of a man who had never once been held accountable, was gone. What was left looked older and smaller, and genuinely frightened. "You can't freeze the operating account," he said. His voice had gone thin. "We have payroll on Friday. We have 43 employees who get paid on Friday. The freeze includes a carve-out for payroll obligations already scheduled," David said. "Your employees will be paid. The restrictions apply to discretionary expenditures and transfers." He closed his briefcase. "If you're concerned about your employees, Mr. Coleman, I'd suggest that concern arrived about 4 months too late." Richard flinched like he'd been struck. He did not argue. Frank Delgado appeared in the doorway he had come back from, wherever he had gone to make his call. His jacket buttoned, now his face professionally neutral in the way of a man who has just received legal advice and is following it precisely. He looked at Richard with the expression of someone who has made a decision and found it surprisingly easy. "Richard, I'll be in touch through counsel." He looked at Harold briefly, a look I couldn't fully interpret, somewhere between respect and the discomfort of a man who realized too late which side of something he had been standing on. Then he left. His car started in the driveway 30 seconds later. Sarah had been standing near the doorway to the kitchen, her arms wrapped around herself, watching her father-in-law sit at the head of his ruined table. When David finished speaking, she came to me, crossed the room quickly, like she had been waiting for a moment that was finally clear enough to move through, and she put her arms around me and pressed her face into my shoulder and cried the way she used to cry when she was small and the world had done something she didn't have the language for yet. I held her, my daughter. 38 years old and crying like she was 7, and I held her and let her. "I didn't stop it," she said, her voice muffled against my shirt. "Tonight when I saw it happening and I didn't stop it, and I am so sorry, Dad. I am so sorry." "Hey." I pulled back enough to see her face. I put my hand against her cheek the way I had when she was small and frightened. "You raised that boy." I tilted my head toward Ethan, who was standing a few feet away, watching his mother with the focused, serious attention of a child who has just learned something permanent about what love looks like in practice. "You raised that boy, Sarah. Everything he did tonight that came from you, that is not nothing. That is everything." She broke again. Harder this time, her shoulders shaking, one hand pressed flat against my chest, over the pocket where Ethan's drawing was folded. I let her cry. I looked over her head at David, who was speaking quietly with Tom Briggs in the corner, and at Ethan, who had drifted close and was now leaning against my side with his head against my arm, the solid, unself-conscious lean of a child who has decided where he belongs and stopped second-guessing it. After a moment, I said quietly, "There's something I need to tell you. Both of you." Sarah pulled back, wiped her face with the back of her hand. Ethan looked up. 4 months ago, I said, I established a separate, irrevocable trust for you and Ethan, independent of Northbridge, independent of anything connected to Coleman Construction or your father-in-law. I looked at Sarah directly. Your house, the mortgage, the title, I had David acquire the lien 6 weeks ago and transfer it into the trust. Clean. No encumbrances. Richard cannot touch it. Whatever happens in the investigation, whatever judgments come down, that house belongs to you and Ethan and cannot be reached by any of it. Sarah stared at me. Her mouth opened and nothing came out for a moment. Dad, you're not losing your home, I said. I needed you to know that before anything else. Whatever else tonight is, you are not losing your home. She pressed both hands over her mouth. Her eyes filled again, but differently this time. Not grief, not fear, but the particular relief of a person who has been holding their breath for longer than they realized, and has finally been told they can stop. Ethan tugged my sleeve. I looked down at him. Grandpa, he said with great seriousness, did you plan all of this? I looked at this boy, his untucked shirt, his red eyes, his absolutely undiminished gravity, and I felt something move through me that was too large and too old to have a simple name. I planned the parts I could, I told him. The rest, that was you. He thought about this carefully. Then he nodded once, as if filing it away. Richard had stood up from his chair. He crossed the room toward me with the uncertain, effortful movement of a man whose legs were not entirely cooperating, and stopped a few feet away. Up close, he looked like someone had taken something structural out of him. Harold. His voice came out rough. I want to. Not tonight, Richard. My voice was not unkind. It was simply finished. Tonight is done. He stood there for a moment. Then he nodded, the smallest, most defeated nod I had ever seen from a man who had spent 64 years refusing to be defeated. And he turned and walked out of his own dining room. David's phone buzzed twice in quick succession. He looked at the screen, read something, and looked up at me with the particular expression he reserved for moments when a plan had executed exactly as designed, not triumph. David Carter did not do triumph, but a focused, contained satisfaction that I had learned to recognize over 22 years of working together. The TRO came through, he said. Temporary restraining order. Filed 2 weeks ago with the United States District Court for the Central District of California. Supported by the full forensic report, the bank records Tom Briggs's documentation, and the electronic signature metadata. A TRO in federal court is an emergency order. It can be granted the same day it is filed if the evidence meets the threshold, and ours had met the threshold considerably. The assigned judge had been reviewing it since this afternoon. Oh, who signed it? I asked. David looked at his phone again. Judge Patricia Howe. I let that sit for a moment. Patricia Howe had been a first-year public defender in the Pasadena office the summer I was 24 years old and working a construction job 3 blocks from the courthouse. We had met at a diner on Colorado Boulevard. She had been eating lunch alone reading a brief, and I had asked if the seat across from her was taken because the place was full. We had talked for 40 minutes about nothing in particular and everything in general, the way young people talk when they are still deciding who they are going to be. We had not stayed in touch. Life had moved in its separate directions. But I had followed her career the way you follow the careers of people who impressed you when you were young, and Patricia Howe had become exactly the judge I would have hoped she would become: meticulous, unimpressionable, and constitutionally incapable of being moved by anything except the evidence in front of her. I had not called her. I had not contacted her. The case management system of the Central District assigns judges by rotation, and I had no control over who received our filing. But when David had told me 2 weeks ago that Judge Howe was on the rotation that week, I had exhaled for the first time in a long time. Oh well. The order freezes all personal assets held in Richard Coleman's name or jointly with any family member. David continued reading from his phone. Real property, financial accounts, vehicles, and any interest in privately held entities. Margaret Coleman is named as a related party. Her personal assets are subject to the same restrictions. He lowered the phone. He can't move anything. Not tonight, not tomorrow, not until the court releases the order or the matter is resolved. I nodded. From somewhere deeper in the house came the sound of raised voices. Richard's voice, I thought. And another voice I didn't recognize, tighter and more controlled. Then a door closing hard. Then quiet. Margaret Coleman appeared in the dining room doorway. She had her handbag over her arm and her car keys in her hand, and the expression of a woman who had made a calculation and arrived at a number she didn't like. She looked at David first, then at me, then at the documents still spread across the white linen tablecloth. "I'd like to leave," she said. "Of course," David said pleasantly. "Though I should mention that your vehicle is registered in your name, which means it falls under the asset restriction in the TRO. Driving it tonight could be characterized as disposal of a restricted asset." He tilted his head. "I'd recommend calling a car service and calling an attorney, in that order." Margaret's hand tightened on her car keys until her knuckles showed white. She stared at David for a long moment, with the specific fury of a woman who has been outmaneuvered and knows it, and has not yet decided how to arrange her face around that knowledge. Then she sat down in the nearest chair, opened her handbag, and took out her phone. David turned back to me and lowered his voice. "There's one more thing. I sent the full documentation package to Carla Rivera at the Los Angeles Times 40 minutes ago, after Richard declined your offer to speak privately. She's been covering financial fraud in the construction industry for 3 years. She'll know what she has." He paused. "The story will likely run tomorrow morning." I looked at the dining room, the ruined dinner party, the cold prime rib, the white orchids still perfect in the center of the table, indifferent to everything that had happened around them. The crystal glasses catching the chandelier light the same way they had 3 hours ago, when this room had been Richard Coleman's kingdom, and I had been the man he put at the far end of the table near the kitchen door. "Harold." David's voice pulled me back. "Are you all right?" I thought about the question honestly, the way he deserved. My cheek still ached where Richard's hand had landed. The taste of copper had faded, but not entirely gone. I was 66 years old, and I had driven 40 minutes to a dinner I had known would be terrible, and it had been exactly as terrible as I had expected, and in several ways considerably worse. "I will be," I said, "when this is over." "It's largely over," David said. "I know." I reached up and touched the breast pocket of my shirt, the slight rectangular shape there, the soft edges of a folded piece of paper. "I have one more thing to do tonight." David nodded. He had worked with me long enough to know when I was finished explaining. Outside on the long, pale driveway, I could hear the sound of additional vehicles arriving, not SUVs this time, but the particular engine sound of local law enforcement, unhurried, deliberate, responding to the notification that had gone out from the federal court, along with the TRO. Richard Coleman had built this house to announce what he was. Tonight, for the first time, it was doing exactly that. The summer burned itself out slowly, the way Southern California summers do, not in one dramatic moment, but in a gradual, almost reluctant cooling, the evenings getting longer, and the light going softer, and the jasmine in the yard coming back after the heat had driven it down. By September, the nights were finally bearable. I will tell you what happened briefly because it deserves to be said and then set aside. Richard Coleman was indicted on 6 counts of wire fraud and 2 counts of misappropriation of fiduciary funds by the United States Attorney's Office for the Central District of California in late July. Margaret Coleman was named as a co-conspirator on 3 of those counts. The Bel Air estate was placed under court order for liquidation to satisfy the judgments against the estate not sold. Yet these things take time, but the process had begun, and the olive trees and the iron gates and the coffered ceiling Richard had renovated with money that wasn't his would eventually belong to someone else. Carla Rivera's story ran in the Los Angeles Times on the morning of June 16th. By noon, it had been picked up by the Associated Press. By evening, it was national. The headline was precise and without drama, the way good journalism is. Bel Air construction executive faces federal charges following Father's Day confrontation with investor. Richard Coleman's name appeared in the first paragraph. Mine did not appear until the 14th. I had asked Carla for that specifically. She had obliged. Daniel had entered into a non-prosecution agreement with the U.S. Attorney's Office in early July. He had provided everything: emails, contracts, text messages, a recorded phone call he had made on his own initiative 3 weeks before Father's Day, when he had finally understood the shape of what his father was doing. He had been thorough. His attorney, David's firm, as offered, had told me Daniel had been the most cooperative witness she had worked with in 15 years of federal practice. He was working now for a mid-sized construction firm in Pasadena. Project manager, the same title he'd had at Coleman Construction, the same work, different people. Sarah had told me he came home tired, but not hollowed out the way he used to. That he was sleeping better. That Ethan had started going to his games again on weekends. Linda and I had spoken once briefly by phone in early August. It had been a decent conversation. Not warm, not cold, just honest in the way that conversations can be honest when both people have stopped needing something from each other. She was staying with her sister in Scottsdale for the time being. She said she was thinking. I told her that seemed right. We had left it there. I sent Glenn a text message the morning after Father's Day. 3 words: "You were right." He had replied 4 hours later with 6, "I know. Coffee when you're ready." We had gone the following Saturday, same diner on Colorado Boulevard, same terrible coffee. We had talked for 2 hours. He had not said "I told you so," which was one of the many reasons I had known him for 40 years. All of this is the accounting of it. The ledger. The facts that can be stated in sentences and filed and cited. What cannot be filed is what happened on a Tuesday evening in the second week of September, when the air had finally gone soft and the jasmine had come back. And I was sitting on the front porch of my house in San Gabriel Valley, with a mug of coffee going cold in my hands. Ethan came out through the screen door and let it bang shut behind him the way he always did. I had stopped mentioning it, and dropped himself into the chair beside mine with the full, unself-conscious weight of a child who has decided that wherever you are is exactly where he wants to be. He was quiet for a moment. Not an uncomfortable quiet. The quiet of a person who has something to say and is deciding how to say it. "Grandpa," he said. "Yeah, buddy." He pulled his knees up to his chest and wrapped his arms around them, looking out at the yard where the jasmine was climbing back up the fence post it had retreated from in July. "Why did you never tell anyone you had all that money? Like, not Mom, Not Linda, not anybody. I looked out at the yard. The evening light was doing what evening light does in September in the San Gabriel Valley, going gold and then amber and then the particular shade of rose that lasts about 4 minutes and then is gone. When your great-grandmother Margaret was alive, I said, she used to say that money is a mirror, pointed at people and you see exactly what they're reaching for. I wrapped both hands around the mug. I didn't want to see that. I wanted to see the people. Ethan thought about this with the seriousness he brought to everything. But you saw it anyway, he said. At the dinner. I did, I said. And Grandma Linda. He stopped himself. Looked at me sideways, checking whether this was a door I wanted opened. It's all right, I said. You can ask. Did she love you? Like the real you? Or just the you she thought you were? I breathed in the jasmine and the cooling air, and the particular September evening quiet of a neighborhood where people were inside making dinner, and the street was empty, and the light was doing its 4-minute thing above the fence line. I think, I said carefully, she loved who she thought I was. And I think those two things were close enough for long enough that neither of us noticed the difference until it mattered. I looked at him. That's not her fault, and it's not mine. Sometimes things just show you what they are when the pressure comes. Ethan nodded slowly. Reached over and patted my arm, twice the same gesture he had made earlier that evening at the dinner table, the old man reassurance of a 10-year-old who had decided he was responsible for the emotional well-being of his grandfather. I don't need you to be rich, Grandpa, he said. His voice was matter-of-fact and complete the voice of someone stating something so obvious it barely needed saying. I just need you to be you. My throat tightened in the way it had been tightening all summer at unexpected moments in the grocery store on the freeway, standing in my kitchen at 6 in the morning with the coffee maker running and the house quiet and the full weight of everything that had happened settling into its permanent shape. I reached up and pressed my hand flat against my chest, over the breast pocket of my shirt, over the place where a folded piece of paper had been sitting since a June evening in Bel Air when a 10-year-old boy had pressed it into my hands and told me not to let them make me small. I was still carrying it. I suspected I always would. You know something, buddy, I said. What? I looked at this boy, his knees pulled to his chest, his dark eyes watching me with that attention that had always startled me. This child who had stood in a dining room in Bel Air and pointed his trembling hand at a man twice his size and said, that is wrong, when every adult in the room had decided it was easier not to. Of everything I built in my life, I said, and I built a great deal, you are the best of it. Not because of me, because of who you already are. Ethan's face did the thing it did when he was trying not to need something and needed it completely, the brief, controlled tremor, the quick blink, the recovery. Then he leaned over and put his head against my shoulder. We sat there as the light went gold, and then amber, and then rose, and then faded entirely, and the jasmine came through on the evening air, and somewhere down the street a sprinkler came on, and the coffee in my mug went fully cold, and I did not move to go inside. For the first time in a very long time, there was nowhere else I needed to be. There's something I've come to understand, standing on the other side of all of it. Money didn't save me that night. Preparation didn't save me. What saved me, what has always saved me, was knowing who I was before I walked through that door. I believe God puts certain people in our lives to show us the truth about ourselves. That night, He sent me a 10-year-old boy. Here's what I want to say directly from one person to another. Don't do what I did. Don't spend years absorbing cruelty and silence because you love someone too much to cause disruption. Don't mistake endurance for strength. Real strength is knowing when enough is enough and saying so out loud with your spine straight. Family stories like this one happen every day in houses that look perfect from the outside. I know because I lived inside one. Family drama and revenge is not something I sought, it found me when I finally stopped moving out of its way. And the most important thing I learned from this particular family story of revenge is that dignity, once surrendered, costs far more to reclaim than it ever would have cost to keep. If this story landed somewhere close to your heart, leave a comment below. Tell me what you would have done differently. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you believe that stories like this one matter, subscribe so you never miss the next one. Thank you for staying until the end. A final note: some stories on this channel contain fictional elements crafted purely for storytelling and reflection. If that's not what you're looking for today, no hard feelings, step away and find what serves you better. But if you're still here, I'll see you in the next one.